Okay, everybody, if you can take your seats, please. Yes, Maggie, talking away. It's terrible. Okay, so we're going to resume with Russell Smith, talking about the life of Errol Barrow, which I'm really excited for. Russell's a volunteer here, so it's super exciting. I'll let him say a few words about himself to start. I'm going to go with Harry as well, who's, again, say a few words, get them on video, share them later. But Ruben, if you are happy to read, and we'll get going.
So I'll be reading two quotes by Errol Walton Barrow. What does it profit a man to be Prime Minister of Barbados or of the West Indies? What does it mean? It means nothing if you lose your soul and achieve these objectives. We will not regard any great power as necessarily right in a given dispute unless we are convinced of this. Yet, at the same time, we will not view the great powers with perennial suspicion, merely on account of their size, their wealth, or their nuclear potential. We will be friends of all, satellites of none. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Russell. I'll be speaking about Flying Officer Errol Walton Barrow, Navigator and Prime Minister. Errol Walton Barrow's gravestone boldly displays prominent features of a life so legendary and so loved back in his home nation. Barrow was born in Nesfield, Barbados, on 21st of January 1920 to a family line merging two quite divergent family backgrounds. One of his grandfathers, Joseph J.C. O'Neill, owned the Nesfield plantation, one of two he owned, showing already that Barrow had been born into some landed investment in the nation. But in addition to that, the paternal side of his family background offered some military pedigree. His other grandfather, Robert Barrow, though a blacksmith by trade, served in the British West Indies Regiment in the 1870s and was also a veteran of the Boer War. Robert Barrow's son, the Reverend Reginald Barrow, was a forward thinker, considered a socialist somewhat ahead of his time in some ways. Reginald eventually earned his way to becoming headmaster of the Alliance School, though the perception of him, somewhat radical, no doubt backed up by ties to Marcus Garvey's movement in the 1920s, meant that Errol spent his high school years under guardianship of relatives on his mother's side, as his parents faced an exile of sorts in New York. Still, such influence remained deeper than that. He began his own path to prominence, starting with his studies. Indirectly, he felt the influence of Booker T. Washington in that his primary school had been modelled on the philosophies of the Tuskegee Institute that the legendary African reformist founded. African-American, sorry. Errol Barrow won 3 scholarships, with the last in 1939 to study classics at Codrington College, once the establishment of his father too. However, war had broken out, and Barrow declined the opportunity to follow in his family's footsteps. Instead, he left for Britain to volunteer for the RAF. Barrow joined the RAF in London in 31st of December 1940 and was eventually selected as an observer or navigator. First training in Britain, it was during his service that he met a pilot officer who would become a lifelong friend of his, Andrew Cole. I'll skip back to this in a minute, but Andrew Cole's on the left there, and Barrow is the second on the left. Sorry about that. Yes, Cole described their first meeting during training with RAF Coastal Command at Number 31 Operational Training Unit, Royal Air Force, Debert Airfield, in Nova Scotia, thus. The Hudson carried a crew of 4, navigator, 2 wireless operators and air gunners, and a pilot, and we were told we had to form a crew. To start this process, we pilots, some 35 of us, went into a room where we found a similar number of navigators. They were all white, as one would expect in the Royal Air Force at that time, except one handsome black sergeant. I immediately went up to him and asked if he would fly with me. He agreed to, and so began my friendship with Errol Barrow. This idea of approaching someone never been seen before and placing one's life quite literally in their hands happened many thousands of times, of course, during those years of the Second World War. But I'm still amazed when I look back to think what chances we're all taking. Not only did we have no idea how well one chap could navigate or another fly an aircraft, we didn't have any idea how they would behave when under the pressure we knew we would soon be faced with. I should mention here that I did not tell Errol when he flew with me for the first time on the 22nd of February 1943. I did 3 takeoffs and landings with him in the Hudson Mark III, number 617. I had never before flown the Hudson solo. Errol proved to be a first-class navigator, and I can never remember a cross word passing between us, in spite of some tense times we went through together. Incidentally, Errol was very proud of the fact that he wore the old winged O on his left breast. This was the original job title, observer, and meant that he had qualified and been presented with his wing before the name was changed to navigator and the O replaced with an N. After training in Britain and Canada, Barrow was commissioned as an officer in 4th of November 1944. He was posted to 88 Squadron, 2nd Tactical Air Force, and completed 48 bombing operations against targets in occupied Europe and Germany. His squadron leader, Alfred Barnes, rather quotably described him as a bloody good navigator, first class. Get you there, get you back. Never saw Barrow get in the flap. Good man to have along. After VE Day, now Flying Officer Barrow had the honour of being chosen as the personal navigator of Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir William Sholto Douglas, commander of the RAF in Germany. It was in World War II that he saw firsthand the brutality that European ruling classes executed in waging warfare. Hillborn Abe Watson commented within his study of Errol Walton Barrow and the post-war transformation of Barbados. Watson also noticed a strong influence his uncle, Charles Duncan O'Neill, had in terms of his political development. One of a few things. As part of this observation, there was no question when he also noted with some appreciation the cultural heritage that Britain had offered his home nation. But the RAF experiences brought him a fresh perspective, fostering a keener political awareness in him. He had a lot to work with and a lot of work to do once he returned home. Barrow was drawn to politics, and after graduating from London School of Economics with a bachelor's degree in economics and industrial law in 1949, whilst also reading law at the Inns of Court, he was called to the bar in 1950, that same October returning to Barbados as a lawyer. It was a vocational path he notably shared with a number of his Caribbean wartime counterparts, including Cy Grant, Johnny Smythe, and Ulrich Cross and Dudley Thompson. Notably, his mentor at London School of Economics, Professor Harold Lakshee, mentored one Flight Lieutenant Michael Manley as well, another World War II RAF officer, pilot in his case, and I'll come back to him in a minute. As a lawyer, Barrow first joined the Barbados Labour Party, although some differences in opinion saw him break away from that and in late April 1955 become a founder member of the Democratic Labour Party. The DLP, as they were, sought to press for social and political reform and independence from British rule, helping the people of Barbados to fight against marginalisation by the Empire rule. The DLP came to power in 1961 and Barrow served as Premier, leading his country to independence in 30th November 1966. As Prime Minister of Barbados, Barrow first started by introducing measures to reduce poverty and ignorance and improve the quality of life of ordinary Barbadians, lost sight of the ultimate aim of independence. He recognised that to do that successfully, the nation had to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, and took pains to further develop industry, commerce and tourism on the island. Barrow lessened Barbados' reliances on foreign powers, and especially the United States, and in particular strengthened ties between the English-speaking countries of the Caribbean. One of these countries was Jamaica, which, you remember I mentioned a certain Flight Lieutenant Manley? Well, he'd become Premier of Jamaica himself in 1972. In fact, Manley and Barrow became firm friends and allies. That's my last slide. Errol Barrows served as Prime Minister until 1976, during which time he saw Barbados gain independence a decade before. He managed to return to power later with an overwhelming majority in May 1986, but died in office on the 1st of June 1987. He was aged only 67. Yet the legacy he's left has seen him immortalised in his home nation. There is little doubt that he set foundations in which this very year past he would have had a sense of immense pride as to how far Barbados have come since he became its first Prime Minister. In September 2020, Barbados announced a decision to remove Queen Elizabeth II as its head of state, a move which has sent ripples of discussion around the rest of the Caribbean. Barrow's contemporary of the BLP, Mia Motley, prepared a speech for the Governor-General of Barbados, Sandra Mason, writing, "The time has come to fully leave our colonial past behind. Barbadians want a Barbadian head of state." Even here, in this speech, Barrow made his mark, as Ms. Motley quoted his own 1966 speech, as Barbados then declared independence, strongly advising his fellow citizens against loitering on colonial premises. He was around when the initial discussion occurred through an investigative commission that was formed. Back then, it was not deemed to have sufficient public support, but the notion never truly went away. A referendum was mooted in 2005. A decade later, the Prime Minister of the time, Frindle Stewart, targeted the establishment of a republic to line up with the 50th anniversary of independence. On December the 1st of this year, 2021, Barbados will become a fully fledged republic. In Barbados, Errol Barrow Day is a public holiday celebrated annually on the 21st of January. This public holiday was first officially observed in 1989 and celebrates Errol Barrow's birth on 21st of January 1920. Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker, thank you very much, by the way, Russell. Our next speaker is Harry Ludwer. This is Harry's first paper. So if I can ask you to give him a very warm welcome as he comes to the stage, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harry Ludwer. I am currently a master's student studying history at University College London. I recently completed my undergrad degree at Keele University, and for my dissertation, I chose to research the lives of the 4 Indian pilots who flew with the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War. This will be the focus of my presentation today. Lieutenants Hardit Singh Malik, Indralal Roy, Sri Krishna Chandra Velinkar, and Errol Chandra Sen are now gaining the recognition they deserve. However, few people realise that their individual paths to joining the RFC were complex and at times mired with difficulty. This presentation will begin by examining the recruitment policies of the British Armed Forces in 1914, describing how they evolved as war continued. It will also show how external factors led to the acceptance of non-European personnel in the RFC. It will then explore, the Indian pilot's background and education, drawing upon the use of the study of emotions to explain why they chose to fight for the British Empire. The final section will focus on the legacy of the 4 pilots, discussing the role their stories play in the remembrance of the 1.5 million Indian, African, and Caribbean volunteers that contributed so much to Britain's victory in the war. To begin with, it is important to understand what type of environment the 4 Indian men were entering. With its inception in 1912, the RFC was very much in its infancy. Pilots wanting to join the Corps had to fund their own training at civilian flying schools, and they often received inadequate instruction. For example, Velinkar from Mumbai paid for flying lessons here at Hendon and was awarded Royal Aero Club Certificate number 3327 on the 10th of August 1916. Although Velinkar had obtained the necessary training, he was, however, turned down by the RFC when he applied to be a pilot. It was not until March 1917 that he was finally accepted. Velinkar's initial rejection is helpful in understanding the racial policies of the time, taking into consideration not only those of Britain's armed forces, but also the European empires and their armed forces. Historians such as Santanu Das, Kaushik Roy, Kim Wagner, and Gavin Rand have examined the way these racial policies were applied to the Indian Army and how they highlight the way British recruiters exploited the martial race theory. This theory categorized Indians of different races and castes in relation to their supposed ability as warriors. In the words of Kaushik Roy, the martial race theory was a sophisticated version of divide and rule. Introduced in response to the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the theory was used by the British to ensure the loyalty of the Indian Army by deliberately excluding educated middle-class Indians from serving. It was claimed that these men lacked the desired masculine qualities of physical courage and loyalty compared to other groups. In practice, warrior-like men whom the British considered faithful, such as the Gurkhas from Nepal and the Sikhs from the Punjab, were recruited instead of educated Bengalis. As well as the operation of martial race theory in India, the ban on black and South Asian men joining the British Armed Forces needs to be examined. The Manual of Military Law of 1914 stated that commissions would be given only to those who are natural born or naturalised British subjects of pure European descent. They were also prevented from applying to become commissioned officers because it was believed British troops would not accept non-white officers leading them into battle. The use of South Asian and African Caribbean troops in a European war was problematic in itself. On the one hand, the British wanted to uphold the system of racial hierarchy to maintain their control of the empire. Yet on the other hand, they were engaged in a war which required Indian and black men to kill Europeans. This would disrupt the racial hierarchies which operated in all of European empires at the time. Santanu Das captures this fear that European empires had at the time, stating, if a coloured man were trained to raise arms against another European, what guarantee was there that he would not one day attack his own white master? Despite these racial policies, the restrictions were relaxed, and a small number of black and Indian recruits were eventually accepted by the British Armed Forces. On the 6th of November 1916, Lieutenant Jijiboy Pirashaw Bomaji Jijiboy was commissioned into the RFC. Lieutenant Jijiboy was forced to resign his commission due to ill health soon afterwards, but an important foundation had been set. At this point, I would like to draw your attention to 2 key players in the story. Major General Sir Hugh Trenchard, the tough, uncompromising commander of the RFC in France, and Brigadier General Sir Sefton Branca, the RFC's forward-thinking Director of Air Organisation in Whitehall. Trenchard strongly believed that the RFC aircraft should be used offensively to win air superiority over the Western Front, and he therefore ordered his squadrons to adopt aggressive tactics to take the fight to the enemy. Trenchard's tactics consumed large numbers of men and aircraft, and while aircraft could be replaced relatively easily, replacing trained pilots and observers was much harder. The pressure to find more aircrew continued throughout the Battle of the Somme, which lasted from July to November 1916. While this shortage partially explains why the 4 men were accepted, reference also needs to be made to the growing demand within India for Swaraj, otherwise known as self-rule, and for Indian soldiers to be commissioned as officers. Eventually, a compromise was reached whereby temporary honorary commissions were made available to selected Indians. Clive Richards also suggests that Sir Sefton Branca may have played a crucial role in the push for the use of Indian pilots. To quote, one of his responsibilities was the selection and commissioning of RFC officers. Branca had himself served in India and was accustomed to working with Indian people. He also appreciated how their talents could be utilised to help Britain's war effort. His more progressive views matched with the British government's urgent need to find large numbers of men to fight the war. Here we can see martial race theory and subsequent racial policies as a construct, constantly adapted to suit British needs. Velinkar, Malik, Sen and Roy were accepted to train as officers in the RFC between March and July 1917. Perhaps some of you in the audience are wondering why these men were so keen to participate in the war. I know that I speculated about their motives when researching about their lives. As I delved deeper, I began to appreciate the value of the study of emotions, which is growing in importance as a technique of historical research in helping us understand more about them. To simplify, the study of emotion gives regards to individuals or groups, thought processes and feelings, and helps understand why they carried out certain actions or their reasons behind them. When war broke out in August 1914, the 4 men were in England, studying at some of the world's best universities and schools. Malik was at Balliol College, Oxford, whilst Velinkar was being educated at Jesus College, Cambridge. Roy was at St Paul's School in London, and Sen was attending Russell School in Fleetwood, Lancashire. While being educated, the 4 Indians underwent a process of cultural assimilation, adopting the language, values and beliefs of the mother country. Laddie Roy had by 1914 completely forgotten his mother tongue, and in an interview in the 1980s, Malik said after being in Britain since the age of 14, his thought process was very much like those of the British people. Although where they were educated is crucial, it is not necessarily what they learnt in these schools, but what these schools offered them in the way of social networking. Although a new organisation, the RFC reflected Britain's class structure, and it recruited its officers largely from the public schools. Thus, having access to the right contacts greatly benefited the 4 Indians. For example, at Balliol, Malik became friends with his tutor, Francis Urquhart. When Malik was rejected twice by the British Army, Urquhart not only played a part in him being accepted into the French Red Cross, but he later sent a strong letter of recommendation on his behalf to Major General Sir David Henderson, the RFC's Director General of Military Aeronautics. Likewise, a friend of Injalal Roy's family was able to contact Branca directly to obtain an interview for Roy in February 1917. Undoubtedly, being exposed to the privileges of the British education system helped the 4 Indians progress, and it shaped the way they viewed themselves within society and how society viewed them. At the same time, however, they also experienced the blatant racial discrimination represented by the British Army's formal colour bar, coupled with the more general distrust of Indians felt by many in Britain at the time. In her fascinating book, For King and Another Country, Shrabani Basu notes that despite there being over 1 million volunteers serving in the Indian Army, those Indians that tried to sign up in Britain were met with scepticism. This complex situation is likely to have had an impact on the pilots both psychologically and emotionally. Here Ms. Basu comments, whilst referring to Malik, "We were told this war was for freedom, But we as Indians were under foreign rule, so how are we supposed to join this war for freedom? Miss Basu also makes the point that as a Bengali, Ladi Roy wanted to prove that men from the so-called non-martial races could fight just as well as the men traditionally recruited by the Indian Army. Here, Miss Basu quotes Roy's older brother Buresh, who joined the Honourable Artillery Company. Buresh stated, "We were keen to prove that the non-martial Bengali could fight as well as any other soldier." These comments are extremely helpful in forming an understanding as to not only how the Indian pilots viewed the predicament they were in, but also why they wanted to fight. Perhaps the main reason the 4 Indians wanted to fight was the fact that they saw themselves as imperial citizens, as part of a greater collective, the British Empire. Lalita Roy, Ladi's mother, brought him up to believe that because Indians lived under British rule, they should immerse themselves in their way of life. This would of course mean fighting in the war. As I have said, the middle class in India were considered by some British officials to be a potential threat to the Raj due to their education and political awareness. Furthermore, some of these officials believed that they were supporting the war primarily to help India gain eventual self-rule. The British had traditionally applied martial race theory to combat this, but the urgent need for Indian manpower during the war saw an easing of racial policies such as martial race theory and the colour bar, and also demonstrated the flexibility of the armed forces when necessary. What is important here is how this impacted the 4 Indians as individuals. Martial race theory questioned their masculinity because the Indian middle classes were considered unwarrior-like. As a result, being given the opportunity to serve in the RFC and demonstrate their prowess as knights of the air, as fighter pilots were sometimes described by the press, would allow them to claim that masculinity. The greatest example of this argument against the martial race theory again came from Roy himself. Between the 9th and 16th of July 1918, Roy achieved 10 aerial victories, earning himself the unofficial status of fighter ace, and he remains India's only ace pilot to this day. The complex ways in which the 4 Indians were treated and the difficulties they face, coupled with the motivation for wanting to fight, are thus of key importance. It is also important to understand the legacy of the 4 pilots have left behind them. I'm sure many of you are aware of the actor Lawrence Fox. Commenting about the film 1917, last year Fox stated that the use of Sikh soldiers in the film was forced diversity. Although his comments can be classed as offensive, there is also a sense of him being ill-informed. The controversy caused by Fox's comment is part of the ongoing debate about Britain's colonial past, and an important aspect of this debate is a call for the curriculum taught in universities and schools to be decolonised. Decolonising the curriculum aims to present a non-biased, even-handed view of history, one which does not favour a certain group or community over another. It is not just about adding non-white authors to pupils' reading lists, but adding them whilst also critically engaging with their ideas. Thus, as Dr. Caroline Garraway at the University College London concluded in a recent interview, adding to the curriculum rather than taking away certain aspects of it is a more viable option. In doing so, a more balanced view of colonial history is given. As Radhika Natarajan has stated, decolonising the curriculum is not an end, but the beginning of a longer process of transformation. It is therefore about steady change rather than a complete upheaval and replacement of one history with another. Perhaps the most telling example of this effect of the debate came in April of this year, when the Commonwealth War Graves Commission publicly apologised for the black and Indian dead not being commemorated individually with headstones after the war, when their British counterparts were. Although the debate about decolonising the curriculum is beginning to gain more attention and support in the Western world, it is a problem which needs to be addressed in India as well. The most outspoken critic of the Indian history is Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who has called for a more even view within Indian history, one that does not marginalise Dalits, otherwise known as untouchables, India's lowest caste. A study conducted by YouGov, commissioned by the British Council in 2014, concluded that 1 in 4 Indians thought that India was fighting the British in World War I. Although this does not necessarily show a lack of appreciation, it does show a lack of knowledge. Where there is perhaps a lack of appreciation is the fact that Indian pilots themselves only gained recognition in 2019 with the commissioning of commemorative stabs showing their portraits. I would like to end by saying that the story of the 4 Indian fighter pilots was by no means a simple one. For the most part, this was because of human nature. We as individuals have unique personalities which are shaped by the cultures and communities we are a part of. The 4 men had lived in Britain for a significant amount of time, and they were educated at some of the country's leading schools and colleges. They embraced and were immersed in the culture of Britain's upper middle classes, and when war came, it was natural that they would want to fight to protect their country. I hope I've shown how the services of Hardit Singh Malik, Injalal Roy, Sri Krishna Chandra Velinkar, and Errol Chanda Sen were affected by issues of race, class, caste, and gender. I also hope that I've shown the significance of their inspiring stories and how they are now being remembered. Lastly, I hope that focusing on the stories of these 4 brave men may help us to appreciate the contribution of the 1.5 million South Asian, African, and Caribbean volunteers that fought for Britain during the First World War. Thank you for listening.
I really enjoyed that. I actually thought I'd have loved to have spoken that well the first time I gave a paper, so really well done. But I think we've got time for a couple of questions only because we're a little bit behind. So I want to make sure we get a question for Russell and a question for Harry. So do you have a question for Russell? So for Harry, so up there. And then a question for Russell? Okay, so mic there. Okay.
I don't need a microphone.
No, we do because we're recording it. So,
Okay.
so we go first, yeah?
Yeah, thank you. That was really both. It's all been excellent today. I was really struck by the. It's sort of a recurring theme with all of the people that we've talked about today. This sort of really educated middle class backgrounds. That these were all excellent people who were probably going to excel anyway in life. That they seem to have been. Intelligent middle class was a recurring theme. Did Errol Barrow talk about the influence of his RAF experience in his later political career? Do you think that he was inevitably going to be the leader he became, or was his RAF experience somehow formative in that?
Right. Yes. I'll try and keep this brief. Partly because there's a lot more I need to read up on that, but the short answer is yes and no on both counts there. Yes, I think part of the larger story is despite his despite his upbringing in class, the conversation about independence needed to be was firmly in the mind of a number of service personnel well before the Second World War broke out. It just accelerated the conversation, and indeed by the end of the war made it pretty much undeniable. It was almost considered part of the deal for what we're fighting. We're going to have this fight for you, and the other part of that being, well, at least we can have a conversation with the British Empire. We cannot have it with we cannot have it with the opposition. So we'll fight for you, but after that, we're going to sit down and we're going to have a talk. So.
Okay, great. Yes, please.
Hello, Harry. I really enjoyed your presentation. The question I have for you is, when you started to research this, how did your family members feel about you pulling up these stories from the past and your wider family network?
Well, you could ask them, they're right there. But, yeah, I think they were fascinated, actually. I think they were surprised that there was 4 Indians that were able to fight in the RFC. And I think, I guess what it meant for the bigger picture and what it meant for India in itself due to the fact that they were trying to gain independence. And I guess how their story paved the way for the Indian Air Force to be formed in 1932, and how it continued, and how it is what it is today. So yeah.
Okay, great. I think so. We've got time for one more question. Go on, Josh, you've got your hand up very quickly.
I just, for both of you really, I just wondered, I mean, we're here at the RAF Museum. What was it, if anything, about the Royal Air Force that encouraged people to join? So you've got a Prime Minister of Barbados, Jamaica, you've got all these people who, the impression is that they're coming specifically to the Flying Corps, to the Royal Air Force, as opposed to, well, that's the impression. Maybe it isn't the case, but was there something in the RAF, Royal Flying Corps, flying services, that made them attractive? I mean, you know, how you talked about Knights of the Air. Was it the glamour, or were there other elements as well?
I'll take part of this, but yeah. I certainly think the glamour was a part of it. From my end of things, and having and some of what I've seen, although possibly retrospectively, there was some advantage in there being there was some advantage in the Royal Flying Corps being fledgling services at the time as well. They could have, again, it comes back to conversations that can be had, and yes, there was some. There's certainly been some more than reasonable evidence that the RAF has been considered the more accepting of the services to service from the rest of the world. So that has been a strong part. There's been a strong part of things as well. I mean, they were the RAF were certainly after the war were the ones most out of the free services were the ones who didn't ask for the colour bar to be put back on afterwards. So there's a whole other conversation there, but keeping this brief.
I think the 4 pilots proved that they were very capable of joining. They had all the right credentials, being part of public school boys. You had the old boys network as well, and proving that the colour bar and the martial race theory, which was implemented, was all a facade. You had Roy, who achieved 10 kills. Malik achieved 2 himself. Sen achieved 1 himself as well. So I think the environment they were in, best suited for them to join the RFC as well. So yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I think. Well, is it going to be a quick question? Okay, go on. Oh, Sam, if you run over, please, because I've stolen Nina's mic. So, gentleman, just on the side.
Hi, can you hear me? Yep. Yeah, it's actually a comment rather than a question, because when Russell talked about Errol Barrow, he mentioned he was friendly with John Smythe, who was my dad, and he joined the RAF, and he was shot down on his 27th mission. He was captured, etc. Now the reasons for joining are similar to what you've heard before: the British Empire, a little bit more complex because it was West Africa. And we have issues to deal with the slave trade, and interestingly, that led to an affinity to Britain. But in terms of why he chose the RAF, it was the most glamorous of the forces. No question about that.
I think that's always a perfect moment to end on. So if we thank our speakers, I'm going to quickly...
Thanks for that, by the way.
Right, well, I'm going to talk today. I was going to spend quite a lot of time sort of at the beginning outlining the various different contributions which were made to the RAF, because what I really wanted to stress was that this was a multinational effort, and then go into one particular instance. So if you can see in the aircraft behind, that's a Polish aircraft. And that's a really important point because, of course, 14,000 personnel from Poland served in the RAF. There were something like 2,500 Czechs. The Caribbean contribution, 5,500 ground crew alone, 300 to 500 air crew. That's a really important contribution. The numbers start adding up, and that's before we get into Dominion forces, such as Canadians. Of course, at this point, you couldn't get Canadian citizenship, slightly different period. Huge contributions to the RAF fighting and winning the war, and so Britain winning the war. And that emphasis on ground crew is really important as well. We're going to talk about the sort of glamour of the pilots. Really, they're just chauffeurs, aren't they? That's certainly what any navigator will tell you. But air crew, they're all glamorous stories because they're in the thick of the action. But the grind of the day-to-day is done by the ground crew and the support staff, and they are essential to winning the war. So it's a much wider story. But I'm going to talk about one particular colony and service from it. Now, if I tell you that this was a country which Britain took advantage of an ethnic division in, to rule by a policy of divide and rule, and that it ultimately led to violence and partition, it won't really narrow it down for you. That's a story which is all too common. I think the wily amongst you might know that I'm about to go off on a tangent and we'll be trying to get ahead. So if I tell you that this was a strategic colony and a European colony, some of you might have ideas which spring to your mind. You might, for instance, be thinking of Palestine Mandate, Israel, and Isaac Weizmann, who served in the RAF, the 7th president of Israel. He also fought against the RAF. So quite a unique story. He flew Spitfires against the RAF, fighting over Egypt at one point. So really quite a unique tale. His cousin was shot down while serving with Coastal Command of the Bay of Biscay. And he wrote to his cousin's father saying, I will step into his shoes, essentially. Really, proud story. And I am going to talk about the president of a European and strategic colony, but it isn't Weizmann. I'm going to talk about Cyprus. Now, many of you might not think of Cyprus as being a British colony and one where racial policies certainly did come into it. If I tell you that Britain didn't see Cypriots as being European, that might surprise you in today's day and age, but they did not. Neither Greek or Turkish Cypriots were classified by Britain in its internal policies as being pure European. It was certainly seen as a strategic colony, though there was some debate within the Treasury as to its value. The Colonial Office was convinced of that value, and of course we still have bases there today. This is a very pertinent story for the RAF. And the man I'm going to talk about is Glafkos Tsirides. He goes on to be the president of the Cyprus Republic. He's a hugely important figure in the politics of Cyprus, and he served in the RAF as a wireless operator and an air gunner. He's quite an inspirational man, I think. He served in the RAF, as I say. He volunteered when war broke out. At the same time, his father wrote to the Freedom newspaper in Cyprus, and he said, I was going to write a series of editorials criticising Britain and its politics in Cyprus, because it was a very repressive regime which was in place in Cyprus at this time. The press freedom was reduced, the rights of assemblies. This was a heavily restricted colony, more so than a lot around the world, and it's in Europe. Potentially very embarrassing for Britain. But he said, at the outbreak of war, what we don't want to do is cause a scene. We don't want to press our political agenda. We want to reduce the burden on the colonial administration and demonstrate our loyalty, because they also recognised that this was their fight. I think a really important point. Now, Glafkos Tsirides, had presented a petition to the governor just before he left for Cyprus in 1939, and before war broke out. He's pressing for expressing the friendship of the Cypriot people. He was in London, he was studying for his law exams. War breaks out, and he joins the RAF. Now, he serves with 115 Squadron, check that, and he goes through training. Initially, he enters as a pilot. but he doesn't show sufficient aptitude to progress quickly. He's re-mustered as a wireless operator and an air gunner. And he reaches 115 Squadron in 1942. They're equipped with a Vickers Wellington, and this is a period where 4-engine bombers are coming in, so the Wellington posting is not a great one. And that's demonstrated in Claridas' short time with 115 Squadron. His first operation is on the 8th of July, and in 18 days he flies 6 operations. On the 6th operation, his aircraft is shot down. It was part of a major attack on the 26th of July on Hamburg. 403 aircraft were dispatched, 181 of them were Wellingtons, 77 were Lancasters, 73 were Halifaxes, and there were an additional 60 aircraft, including the Hamden. And that force was probably the maximum effort that Bomber Command could produce at this stage of the war. Now, the after-action reports suggest that the attack, made from heights of around 13,000 to 16,000 feet, was highly successful. Pretty exceptional for Bomber Command at the time, to be honest. But this is an important attack on a real target here, and it does around 250 million Reichsmarks worth of damage. That's about 25 million pounds. 5,000 homes were destroyed, 14,000 people were bombed out, 337 people were killed, and 1,000 were injured. However, 29 aircraft were lost. 15 Wellingtons, 8 Halifaxes, 2 Hamdens, 2 Lancasters, to be on a Lancaster squadron at this point in the war, right? And 2 Stirlings. That's 7.2% of the force. And 4 of the 15 Wellingtons were from 115 Squadron, and Claridas was amongst that number. Now, Claridas' story is fairly exceptional. He is, a unique individual, but that diverse background isn't particularly unique. Also in 115 Squadron, there was the Sergeant William Crustacean, who was born in Canada, but to parents who were both Ukrainian, from a Ukrainian family. And Crustacean was killed on the next night of operations after Claridas was shot down. Earlier in the war, Sam Miara, a number 1938 Squadron wireless operator, was killed on board a Wellington in the Middle East, same aircraft. Sam and his wife Doris had responded to Kristallnacht pogroms by selling their clothing business and joining the RAF in 1938. They saw the war coming and they were willing to give up their business to join the RAF and fight for Britain and for freedom. And it wasn't just British Jewish personnel who were involved in this story. Jewish refugees from across Europe also served in the RAF during the war. And so Sam Miara and his wife Doris their letters are in our archives, and I find them they cut me quite deeply when I read them. They're really, if you want to have your heart broken, reading those letters is a good way of going about it. But Tauzik, German Jewish origin, he actually wears the Czechoslovakian badge. He tries to join a Czechoslovakian squadron and they won't have him because he is of German descent. He's from Sudetenland. Really show the sort of the divisiveness of that area. He escapes Germany. He's arrested in 1939. He escapes in the Kindertransports. He arrives in Britain. He joins the RAF. He's trained, and in 1945 he's flying in Italy against the Germans, undertaking tactical reconnaissances. And refugees and emigres made a really important contribution, particularly to Bomber Command. Their language skills were highly prized, and in the radio war which we fought against the German night fighter defense systems, that contribution was enormous, really important. There's some fantastic stories. But I want to talk about Cypriots today, not just in the Air Force, the WAF as well. This is Fracadie Rosadou Jones, who was studying in Britain, but returned immediately to Cyprus to enroll in the WAF there, and she subsequently became an artist in Cyprus. You can see this mural of her created today. And here, this is Nikki Giorgio, who joined the WAF in 1941. She had been working as a nursemaid, she joined as a tailor, and these images were produced as part of a British propaganda campaign to promote multinational contributions to the British war effort. Now, moving on a little bit, there's another Cypriot who serves in the RAF, who's Flying Officer Stefanos Steve Haralambos. He's originally an engineer, and he arrives in England studying his maritime engineering exams. When war breaks out, he also joins the RAF. He immediately endears himself to No. 7 Squadron and his crew by tuning the navigator's sports car so that it produces much faster performance. It's a touring sports car. It's a Singer. So I don't have an image of either him, unfortunately, or the Singer car, but the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice there is a Singer in this picture, so I have to make do with that, I'm afraid. Of course, 7 Squadron's Pathfinder Force. Hugely important Bomber Command war effort. He flies 50 missions with them, receives the DFC, He's shot down in 1945 in April. So, again, this is the real crux of what the RAF is doing. And it's an attack on the Harburg oil refining facility on the outskirts of Hamburg. His aircraft gets a direct hit. The entire crew is lost. Explodes over the target. However, Clerides' war didn't end when he was shot down. You can see this is the operational record book of 115 Squadron. Having been hit by flak over Bremen as the aircraft returned from the Hamburg raid, the Wellington was seriously damaged, which Clerides was in. It caught fire, and at least 3 of the crew, including Clerides himself, who sustained a flesh wound, were injured. He was disconnected from the intercom system, so he couldn't hear any of the chatter within the aircraft about whether or not he should stay or go, and so he made a very wise decision, as it turned out, to bail out. The aircraft came down in the sea, the rest of the crew parachuted out over the sea, and 2 of them died from exposure before they could be rescued. They were rescued by a German seaplane. So Clerides lands in a field in Germany. He breaks his leg doing so, same leg which he's been injured in, so he's having a bad time of it. German civilians approach him, and they mistake him for a Jew. So they assault him, they batter him. He's rescued by the Luftwaffe and taken to a prison. But this isn't the end of his war. Clerides goes on to be a prolific escaper. And the first of those happens when he's in hospital recovering from his broken leg. It's a hospital for French prisoners of war. His leg recovers enough, he feels it's set enough that he can try and make a getaway. And now, you have a feeling Clerides has told this story a few times, so there's different accounts of it. On one, he scales down the hospital with sheets tied together, having cut off the plaster cast with a penknife. In another, less glamorously, he hides in a rabbit hutch whilst being allowed to walk in the garden, waits until it's dark, cuts the plaster cast off, makes away underneath a barbed wire fence. In both stories, he escapes with only civilian clothes and a broom. The broom would be an important asset as Clerides made his way across Western Europe towards the Netherlands, hoping to reach the resistance or perhaps the coast. 15 days on the run, with a broken leg which is not fully set, the broom was both a crutch, but also an essential prop whenever he was challenged, because he had no papers. So if ever he was, looked like he was about to be challenged, he furiously worked this broom. The kind of distraction and intensity that brooks no interruption. I think we've all seen people working that intensely. Very few of them are road sweepers in my experience, but that's perhaps the area I grew up in. Unfortunately, however, 30 miles away from the Dutch border, Clerides is arrested. Again, it's difficult to get exact details. It seems like it might have been civilian police. Another account has him trying to depart from a train which he'd got on and being seen by German soldiers. In either event, he spends the next 15, 20 days in a civilian jail before being moved to a camp. But Clerides isn't done trying to escape. That winter, 43, he makes away from the camp, pretending to be, he swapped places with a Greek workman, and he pretends to be a Greek workman working in occupied Europe, in Germany, and that he's on leave and making his way back home to Greece. And this time he has forged papers, and he's spending the next 3 months making his way across occupied Europe, constantly on the run, trying to survive. I don't think it will surprise you if I tell you he doesn't make it. But 3 months is an exceptionally long time to be out. And when he's brought back, he's still active in the escape effort. He's highly intelligent, and there isn't a lot else to do in a prisoner of war camp. He becomes part of the escape committee in the camp which he's based in, and he has a particularly important impact on Ibrahim Salah Bakir, another Cypriot in the British Army, Turkish Cypriot. Bakir is also mistaken as a Jew. In this instance, it's not just his appearance, but his name. And what would be rather farcical if it wasn't so serious, having spent quite a lot of time at the camp already, he and Clerides formed a Cypriot volleyball team and swept the stakes at the camp sports tournament. They didn't have enough Cypriots to play football as a team, so I believe they played in the Irish football team. It's a nice link there. But Ibrahim is one letter away from Abraham, and that's enough at this point in the war to convince the Germans that actually he's a Jew, and that he needs to be detained permanently. He's told to arrive to the camp commandant, where he's informed of this. But very fortunately, he is near Clerides when this happens, and he asks him to come with him. Now, no amount of arguing from Bakir that he is Turkish, not Jewish, that he's Cypriot, European, will convince them. And then Clerides steps in. Having waited there listening to this, he forcefully explains that he's Turkish, he's a Muslim, that he serves in the British Army, but his rights need to be upheld. And then, to resolve the matter, after a very heated argument, he simply takes Bakir and leaves. Now, you can imagine if this goes the wrong way, it's not just Bakir who's in trouble here. This is extraordinarily brave. And Clerides is mentioned in dispatches for his service in the prisoner of war camps. So it's very unique. Clerides hasn't finished yet. He actually escapes before VE Day during the Long March. He gets away from the column. So that as the camps in the east are being evacuated away from the Soviets, he takes the opportunity to Scapa, makes his way towards Western Europe, reaches an American Europe, and by the time VE Day arrives, he's back in Britain. So a truly successful story of resilience, if nothing else. Now, in terms of Turkish personnel from Cyprus who served in the RAF, and I choose my words carefully in describing them because I'm going to save this for the round table. There's layers of identity in Cyprus, really important to understand. So Turkish personnel in Cyprus, Turkish, in Turkey, Cypriot, here, probably depends on where the advantage is. But the only named individual I can come across who is Turkish Cypriot is Novar Hikmet. He was in the RAF in November 1940, when he enrolled. And he served through until 1941 when he let go, probably because he was needed in the civilian workforce. He was a very successful entrepreneur, prominent in the London Cypriot community, and he subsequently goes on to run an industrial catering company amongst a large number of other concerns, including offering orchestral music on demand. So really, all of these addresses, all of these businesses where his address is registered to is quite extraordinary for their diversity, if nothing else. And there's still a fine art studio in West, I think it's just behind sort of Sloane Square area, which is Hikmet Fine Art, which he founded. So he's left the RAF, catering for messes continues, and he takes opportunities which he builds in the RAF to further his business interests. Really interesting story. He buys Gatwick Manor because he realises civil aviation is, excuse the pun, about to take off. And so he realises what that's going to entail, what it means. Gatwick Manor's still there, if anyone's been there. So he turned it into a hotel, made a fortune doing so. So if not a glamorous story, he was the first chartered accountant as well, first Cypriot chartered accountant. He got his exam passed in 37 or 36. Now, not a flyer, not the glamour of the air crew. I don't know if we've got any chartered accountants here today. Unfortunately, glamour is not in their line of work, I don't think. But still an essential story. And we see that in the Caribbean contribution as well. A number of them come over as clerks, which isn't the trade that they wanted to do. They were re-mustered into. And it can seem like that's not an important job to be doing. But actually, it is hugely important because there is so much work which goes on in the administration of an Air Force. So a very important role, even if it's not a glamorous one. But back to Clerides. Because having arrived back in England, he marries. I'm going to check. I think it's Lani to check the name. Skipped ahead. So yes, Clerides has escaped in March. He's come back on VE Day. He marries Laila Aruka, whose father was a respected member of the Jewish community in Mumbai, the first president of the Medical Council of India, and the personal physician to Mahatma Gandhi. So an interesting background in and of herself. She worked in the BBC in their India service, where she met Clerides' sister, who was in the Greek service. As an aside, Hikmet's brother, Ferid, worked in the BBC Turkish service. So you can see these people gathering into certain areas. I think that sort of reflects the point made earlier. These are people with extraordinary abilities anyway, and they will find a use for themselves within this war effort where it's most beneficial for everyone, I think. So yes, he marries Laila. His first date, they were, I think he ate something like 4 cakes in a row because he was so hungry. And she says she only went out with this scraggly, scrawny youth because he looked like he'd escaped from a concentration camp, and she took pity from him, which, I think, a picture of somebody who's been in a prisoner of war camp for 3 years, it's, you're unlikely to come out looking quite the same. Clerides, when he came back, I think weighed only 6 stone. So he resumes his law studies at Gray's Inn after the war. He's called to the bar in 1951, and he subsequently returns to Cyprus, where he goes on to be the president of the House of Representatives, 1960 to 1976. And in 1988, he ran for president. And the opposition launched a smear campaign against Clerides. They said he had been a German collaborator. This is sort of before you can just Google things, you can get records very easily. And so this is a charge which can have real wait time. And to try and refute it, Claridas brought over Baden Faraday and Harry Lindley. They were the two surviving members of his Wellington crew. And for the next 2 weeks, they went around Cyprus talking about how he'd done in the war, his service, his contribution. And the smear campaign didn't stick. Claridas lost the election. In 1993, however, Claridas ran again and became president of Cyprus, a post he held until 2003. And when he left office, he was the last head of state to have seen active service in the Second World War. And he played a really important role. Those of you who know your Cypriot history will know that Turkey, of course, arrives in the north. Very controversial moment, the occupation of northern Cyprus. And he's very active. Markios, the president, has to leave, and Claridas steps in. And this is what he says during that.
Anything can be signed away, except the freedom of one's country. And I cannot, in all consciousness, be the man who will be a traitor to the freedom of his country.
I think if you hear that, it won't surprise you to understand why he also felt he had to fight for Britain in the Second World War, that same cause of freedom. But I'm not going to end on Claridas. As impressive as he is, I'm going to end on the first Cypriot who gained his RAF wings, Christophos Charalambos, or Chris, as he was immediately known in Britain. Because while stationed near Rugby, pilot officer at the time, Charalambos, subsequently gets busted down because he became an instructor, it seems, and was flying too low with his student, joyriding. It's not advised. So he dies over Italy. But whilst in Rugby, he utilised the opportunity to raise funds for a new water supply for his village in Cyprus. It's easy to forget Cyprus was a very poor colony. That's something which, again, we might not immediately think of today. It was not a rich place. And such was the affection and regard that the local town held him in, whether that was because of his joyriding or not, we can't say, that they held a service in his memory after his death in Italy, and they raised further funds for their water supply. And his gravestone is engraved with these words: "Stranger, tell Mother Cyprus here a son died for her own glory and liberty." And I think it's a good moment to reflect that people came from around the world to fight for Britain. They did so for individual reasons. Often those coalesced, but there are layers of identity which people bring with them. We all have that. We all have layers of identity. And I don't think that it should surprise us for those in the Second World War. It might have come because flying was glamorous in the RAF, but also because they wanted to fight for freedom. That those things can coalesce, and that it's hard to pull out what's the most significant aspect. So I'm going to end there and then invite Shrabani and Joe to come down and join us on the round table. So thank you very much. Dash to the podium at times. But I think I really wanted to reflect at the beginning on why I think this is important. And then I think I can ask both of you to do the same, and then we'll go out into the audience. I think we're very keen that this is a conversational moment. We want to get your thoughts and your opinions on this. So we've got around 20 minutes. So we're all happy with that? Okay, so I think that's the real key for me. Why is this important? Because we heard recently somebody claim that, a very prominent historian, I won't say his name, that black history was pushing out British history. This was in Black History Month. And I think it's such an easy line to attack. It's almost like he had wanted to give fodder to people who want to defend these stories, because I think this is our history. This is British history, and it is important for us all to know these stories, because it's part of certainly the RAF stories. The job we have here as the museum is to tell all of the RAF stories from everybody's perspective. It's so important that we carry these stories forward. And I think, for me, it also touches on what history is about. I think a lot of people think history is a static reflection of the past. And it is so much more than that. If anything, history is about the future. It's about using the facts that we know of from the past to point towards where we want to go. And for me, that's why this is so important. I don't know if you want to...
Well, that was very eloquently put. Don't know how much more I'll add to that, but yes, I mean, that is the whole point, that we study it's an inclusive, it's a holistic look at history, and it's also a dynamic, a process that's growing. I mean, when I was in India, and I wouldn't just put this down to Britain, I would say, I studied history in India. I had no idea that, there were men in turbans in these trenches. That was something that passed me by as well. So it's a learning process, and I won't fault anybody, but I think the more we know, the more inclusive it gets. And I heard a Labour politician once, and it really moved me. He said that when he was campaigning, he was chosen in a very white area in Gloucester, and he got up to speak, and somebody heckled from the audience and said, "Bet your grandfather didn't fight in the war." And then he stopped and he said, "Well, actually, he did. He served in Africa." So, and it really hurt him. And then, he was subjected to a lot of racist abuse. And he finally quit politics. But that really moved me. There is this sense of exclusion when you don't say that, when you just say that, Britain fought, won this war and the rest of the colonies were not involved, because they were, it was fault on the shoulders of these people. And I've always been quite passionate about that. So, my book on the First World War and on Noor sort of, I think, flowed out of that. So, yeah. Brief.
And there's a couple of points I'd like to address. I'll begin with the Britain alone narrative, okay, which is a very popular one for obvious reasons. It is true to say that Britain within Europe was very much alone, and there is something very commendable about the fact that Britain chose to keep fighting, but that they weren't alone. And it's important to remember that Britain, if you want to discount the Empire and the Commonwealth, Britain was still leading a multinational coalition against Nazi Germany and against the Axis powers in the Second World War. And this was a very important seminal moment in terms of the bringing together of all these various diverse groups of people from neutral nations, from nations that were occupied, from colonies, from countries that were seeking their independence, following Ireland's example in many cases. And that it was a cause that was considered by many people to be very much worth fighting for, and that there was a lot at stake. Now, I tend to play down the role of ideology. And when I say ideology, I mean people who have defined political views, defined views like anti-fascism in Ireland. But ideological volunteers, and I didn't get to say this in my talk, ideological volunteers among the sample that I analysed when I was examining Irish volunteers in the British forces during the Second World War, the largest contingent of ideological volunteers, and ideological volunteers took up about 30% of the people that I assessed in my study. Vast majority of them were in the RAF. So strongest contingent of ideological volunteers in an oral history sample are all RAF recruits. So there's a very interesting connection between wanting to serve in the blue of the RAF and wanting to do what people feel is morally right at a time when Western civilization, human civilization itself, is under grave threat of, regressing into barbarism. The second point I wanted to address is it's to do with the cultural memory in Ireland. And this is something that is kind of like a sidebar to, I suppose, the attempted rejection of a narrative which we're now embracing, which is that, the war effort was not 100% white, that it was multicolored, that there were people from various different corners of the empire and all over the world of different races, cultures, religious affiliations, ideological affiliations that were committed to the Allied cause, and that their war efforts need to be celebrated at last, and that this has been rejected, or people are attempting to smother it as soon as this effort has come to the fore, this history starts to become popular. In Ireland, there's a similar thing starting to happen, where there's a feeling that they've overindulged. There's been an overindulgence in society in war remembrance, that the embracing of the 1914-18 narrative of those who fought and died in the First World War as part of the national narrative of how our state came into being, as part of what we call the Decade of Commemorations, that this has gone too far. And there's a book that's actually been published just recently. It's about to come out it's been published by Bloomsbury, and it's called The Irish Myth of the Second World War, and it's published by an academic that I know, Bernard Kelly, who has done similar work to myself, but who rejects the narrative that we were somehow kind of, as a neutral society, complicit in the Allied war effort, and that, you know, the Allied war effort or the British war effort was synonymous with something that there was like an Irish home front. And he's right to a certain extent, but what he's arguing is that the veteran story, the story of veterans, Irish veterans of the Second World War in recent times has begun to win out against the narrative of those who served at home, served the cause of Irish neutrality, served in the army, you know, served in the civil defence forces and whatever, keeping the Irish state secure and keeping it, you know, preserving the peace and basically defending Ireland's neutrality, which was very important for our national existence. And what I would argue is that while I accept Bernard's point, at the same time, we're talking about a narrative that has just come to the fore, and people are learning about this for the first time. And almost as soon as this, shall we say, revisionism comes into play, the traditionalists immediately smack it down and say, no, 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 that this was not the case. And they push a very Republican nationalist kind of line and try and, you know, that essentially the separatist narrative is still more important than the other narrative that you're trying to push. And what I would argue is that there's a call for basically balancing both narratives. There's no reason why the Indian nationalist narrative and also the narrative of those Indian soldiers in both world wars that fought and died, that can't consider to be a valid part of India's path to independence. And I believe that to be the case in the context of Ireland. But there are already historians and many people within society who would be very happy to quash that narrative, just strangle it, just as it's been given way. And I think it's all a case of just being willing to consider other narratives and encouraging public audiences and, you know, academic cadres to be willing, you know, to accept that there is another side to the story. It's as simple as that.
I totally agree with that.
Okay, so I think if we take a few points and then we'll reflect on them. So if we go up there, whilst, do we have a question on this side or a comment? Yes, please. Okay, so. Yes, on the left first, please.
Yeah, hello. I noticed that you said something that was very close to my heart, that in school you didn't know there were people with turbans in the war. So I grew up thinking there were no Caribbeans, no people of colour, watching the entire series of World at War, not a brown face to be seen, absolutely adoring history, but dropping it as I got more frustrated, as I got older in school. Everyone was citing me, you're going to do really well in history. I was really into it. The more I asked, where are the brown people? It was the 70s. The more I had resistance, I dropped it. I did my own research. I went to other shops. I went to WGG Press. I went to places in Deptford. How did you feel when you were at school and you suddenly had this light bulb moment when you realised that there must have been there? I asked my mum, who looked at me as a Grenadian as if I was nuts when I said, were there black people in the war, Mum? At 14. So I've done history from all that time with no knowledge and no knowing that they were there. And how did you feel how old were you when you realised, oh, they were there? And then you start doing your own research. That's what happened to me anyway, because you're not getting it from school, and you're still not getting it from school.
Yeah. We take the second one? Okay.
Yes, please.
Similar sentiments, really. So just a quick introduction about myself. My name is Sergeant Pascal Zigambo, and I'm a regular in the Royal Air Force. I've been in for about 15 years. When I joined up 15 years ago, I became the first Malawian to join the Royal Air Force. My primary role is to facilitate and deliver leadership and management in the Air Force. I'm also currently doing a master's in further education, partly funded by the Air Force. So my question to you as an audience is, do you think maybe it's about time the national curriculum got rewritten, just to highlight that important part that the Commonwealth nations did for World War I and World War II. Harry, you've seen some of my tweets, and I've always said Britain never stood alone when we fought the war.
Okay, great. And can we have one more, perhaps? So if we come down to Russell, and then we'll come to you next time, sir. Yes, so Russell, and then we'll... Thank you, Matt.
Hi, I actually kind of wanted to I kind of wanted to chime in on one of the other audience points there, because I had a very similar experience. My light bulb moment kind of came when I was asked to. I've had a stint as a historical interpreter every now and again, but I was asked. But initially, I was working on down in Southsea Castle on matters with Tudor England, and the first year I did it, my director didn't think I'd be able to reliably play any of the soldier roles or any of that, because he didn't know. He got kind of collared by some of his other colleagues later in the year, and I was on the roster for subsequent years after that, and that was exactly what sent me the first way down this path. So I suppose my question or point really is to do with the intentional aspect of this as far as our education went over here. It's clearly in somebody's interest that at least it had been that this had been a narrative at the time. We can't have, we can't be telling a story. We can't be telling stories about black Tudor soldiers or that they served in the wars. That goes against everything we're trying to enforce here. Is that? Is there? I believe there's an element of that, but I'm kind of asking in a sort of loaded way. Is there?
Right. Oh, well, of course. I mean, it's so relevant. But you're lucky. Your light bulb moment came at 13, 14 here. I went to school and university in India, and my light bulb moment came very much later. I mean, I knew Second World War that Indians were there, because mainly, and that too, I knew Burma, Kohima. I knew of all these. First World War, Western Front, in the trenches, I did not know anything. And it's only when I came here, and I started, I'm a journalist, and I started working, came across veterans, and I started talking to them, and that's when my interest in, Indian role in the war, in both wars, started. And, well, it was the centenary that was coming up, in 2014. So about 2 or 3 years before that, I started thinking, I said, the centenary is coming up. I know nothing about the Indians in the First World War, very sketchy details. There's going to be so many books about, all the battles that took place. No one's going to write about the Indians. And I just felt I had to do this. So, and it was a learning process for me. So I had no idea there were pilots in the war, which is something I discovered as I was researching. And that was absolutely fabulous to learn. Hardeep Singh Malik, Laddie Roy, he was like my hero. I said, this 19-year-old boy. And of course, all the soldiers. And I'm not a military historian, so I went to the villages and I tried to trace the descendants and found their stories from the villages, the mountains in India, and followed it. It was a learning process for me, and I just feel so enriched by what I learned. I just feel it has to be in the curriculum. And I have been saying this like a stuck record for, I'd say about 10, 15 years. Any forum I get, I say, put it in the curriculum. It should not just come off a Black History Month, for God's sake. This is, the World War is taught in British schools, teach the whole story. So, yeah.
There was a thought that I had when Harry was giving his very wonderful debut performance. I wanted to say, I wasn't aware of that comment that Lawrence Fox had made about Sikh soldiers, like referring to the film 1917. My criticism of 1917 is that there weren't enough Sikh soldiers portrayed in that film, particularly given the fact that the first responders from the entire British Empire, and the UK included, to the German invasion of Western Europe in 1914 were 4 divisions largely made up of Sikh soldiers, which is something that people completely forget. They also forget the fact that India produced the largest volunteer armies in history, and I get frustrated. I think it's wonderful that black history has been embraced to the extent that it is right now, but I'm still frustrated that Indian history, or the history of the peoples of the Indian subcontinent, is not, and their role in fighting Britain's wars and fighting, really being the hammer of the empire, to be frank. I'm very frustrated that there's still a pushback on that narrative, more so against that than against black history from where I'm sitting. And there's another point I'd like to make. Being Irish, I know what it is to encounter racist abuse, and I know what it is. It's not I don't think it's the same as that encountered by somebody who's non-white. I think obviously that is way worse, but I know what it is to encounter that, and I know what it is to encounter resistance against pushing your narrative or trying to promote your story. I think I think a case in point is my involvement in promoting the story of John Hemingway, who is this country's last Battle of Britain veteran, and essentially is one of the last Irishmen. He was one of 10 Irishmen that fought in the Battle of Britain, and he is now the representative of the few. He's the last surviving one. And there has been a curious lack of engagement with Hemingway's story, I think because people have been rather uncomfortable about the fact that the last representative of the few has an Irish identity. Well, his Irish identity is a pro-British, if you like, Irish identity, because he comes from the Anglo-Irish Protestant community. And at the time, people from his community would have even though they were from Ireland, they considered themselves to be British. But the whole tagline Irish brings with it just the same if you come from the Caribbean or if you come from India or whatnot. There's a whole attachment of negative aspects with that heritage, with that culture, which automatically in some cases can result in wholesale rejection. And I'm not entirely certain if there's any easy quick fix solution, such as introducing a more wholesome syllabus for historical education in schools. I don't know if that'll fix the problem. And I don't know whether pushing this history, which we need to do, is going to result in an adverse reaction that may actually result in a pushback that may actually kill off what we're trying to accomplish here. But I do think that we have made a start. And I think if we push ahead with the right intentions in mind, and without claiming that our narratives are more important than each other's, or than the narrative that has been sold to us ad nauseum for 6 decades now, I think if we can find a balance and a happy medium, and just encourage people to think about, this is the histories of multiple peoples, multiple nations, and to encourage them to think on a more multilateral scale, but do it with gentle steps. I think we'll get there in the end.
Okay, I'm going to reflect on that point whilst we hand the mics out as well. So Nina, if you can take the microphone here. Sam, I don't know if you've got a question as well, but if you give it to Sarah first, because Sarah's the head of Access and Learning, so I'm sure we'll have an interesting point on the curriculum. But I'd just like to say, I think it should be more on the curriculum, but we need to reimagine the Second World War and the First World War as a whole and better teach it across the schooling system. It's not just a case of adding it in. I think it's a case of actually focusing in on telling the story of the Second World War in a better way, if you will, in a way which suits where we want to go. And certainly, I think that whether or not it will be added on the curriculum, we can't control. But we can control the resources that we create to help teachers. And as I pass over to Sarah and then you, sir, that I should reflect, teachers are, of course, very lazy, Sarah, aren't they? And helping them with those resources is, of course, the key. But I think that's really important. We need, all of us, but here at the museum in particular, and that's something which I think we're looking to try and do, create more resources for people to be able to draw on. Because if you make it convenient, if you make it easy, this is a great story. They're inspirational stories. Who doesn't want to teach these stories, really? Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. It is working. So I'm head of access and learning here, and I was just thinking that actually challenging dominant narratives is what I consider to be one of my most important roles. So starting with Ruben, who was employed maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, Ruben. So we now have a storyteller who specialises in telling diverse stories, and that role continues within the team. So Ruben created Flying Colours, which was a performance piece. That has gone on to now be workshops for Key Stage 2, 3 and 4, so upper primary and secondary. And these are a key part of our learning programme. Children that come here from ethnically diverse backgrounds see themselves reflected in our stories. We go right from the First World War, from Robbie Clark, we do Second World War, Lillian Barder, moving through to Trevor Edwards and Sonny Campbell today. So we tell the stories, and we absolutely have an obligation to tell the stories. And I think we're in quite a positive place. Diversifying the curriculum has really, during the last 18 months, come to the fore. So, and I think, I haven't got the numbers to hand, but I think numbers to our programmes have increased by about 50% over the last year. I know from being in work this week alone that 150 upper primary have been to our Pilots of the Caribbean Key Stage 2 workshop, and that teachers feedback that it's absolutely what they need. And to see kids' faces when they're like, oh, there was people like me in the war, they've no idea. We start with, perceptions and what people think people in the RAF are like, and they do still think that they're all tall and white and men. And by the end, they really don't think that. And so it's a small way, but when you were saying that you came across things when you were 14 and 15, I see my role that people are learning that at primary school. So they're not starting from a misapprehension. And in all our resources, we seek to bring out the diversity of the stories, whatever that diversity is. Because, it's our story to share, but it's not a story, it's stories. And people had all their different motivations. And we don't make it seem like the RAF's like the biggest, best recruiter in the world. We explain the problems and we talk about the colour bar. We try and explain that to children. So just to say, we don't gloss over it and we don't make it sound like it's a simple dichotomy and, that there's just one side or the other. So children think about people's motivations and they think about how scary it would have been to leave your home country to come and fight for something you believe in. So I just wanted to say that, here at the museum, that's key to what we do. Whatever the dominant narrative is, we'll look for those other stories. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to come to you in a moment. Sam, if you can find somebody else to take the mic to whilst we're, please.
Well now, you might not think this is relevant initially, but the past few days I've been playing Father Christmas at Lakeside Shopping Centre, and my elf, Natalie, is studying sociology at Gray's College because she wants to become a prison officer. And in between dealing with screaming babies and picky children who don't like their presents, we've been having a bit of a chat, and I told her that I was coming here today and why. And she said when she was at senior school, they were told all about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and the American Civil War. Virtually nothing either about World War I or World War II, and certainly nothing about all the Empire and Commonwealth people who'd contributed to our victory. Have any of you on the platform got a theory as to why this might be?
Okay, and yes, sir.
Our friend's father, Flight Officer Tyndall, Irish nobility, he's a Catholic, shot down 88 Squadron, ended up in Luft 3, Stalag Luft 3, as part of the foraging team for the Great Escape. Did the Irish Catholic who joined the RAF, did they mainly come from the higher echelons, or did they come from all stratas of society?
Okay. So I think, Shrabani, if you want to go first.
Right. That's really interesting. Why wasn't it taught? I think it's because, they were just, it was the British, those who were setting the curriculum, those who were setting the agenda, just celebrating that they won the victory. So all the others didn't matter. It's like, the Americans will claim that they were the only ones and the British will claim they were the only ones. It's part of that, really, excluding the rest, just thinking they did it. That's my theory.
I think the Second World War has become a hot potato. I think they have a choice now. Continue with the tired old narrative, or change it, or don't do it at all. And I think there's a feeling don't do it at all, because this is not, if we change this, it might produce an adverse reaction, or kids' parents might you know, I think it is a hot potato. I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing the Second World War recede. And I come from a country where the history of the Second World War is either taught from a particular perspective or not at all. In other words, we were neutral and the war didn't really affect us. You know, sort of all this kind of stuff happened. We had rationing, the Glimmer Man, all that kind of, you know, and that's only one half of the story. Because a huge proportion of our population, maybe between 1 and 1.5 million, were living in the United Kingdom or throughout the empire. So we were, as a society, we were very much invested in Britain's war. And we had to, because there's no work at home, to be blunt, you know, so we had to be. And to answer your question, Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants, there was such a thing as an Irish working class Protestant back in those days. And people from both communities, from all stratas of society, there were Irish travellers who served in the British Army. I think there was even one in the RAF during the Second World War. They came from all stratas of Irish society, crossing all communal divides, north and south. So there were very few communities, very few segments of Irish society or stratas of Irish society where they did not come, you know, in very voluminous numbers. And I have to say, Southern Irish Protestants, the Southern Irish Protestant community, are exemplary in this particular respect, because to a man and to a woman, they really joined up, those who were of the younger generation in that community. That's really, I think that's really it. Is there any other questions? Okay.
I'm going to let you sound, because you're a student with us, CDA student with Lancaster. You've got the privilege of asking the last question, and then I'm going to reflect on these points as well. So yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting on Harry's talk, the idea of studying emotions. So I teach a class, because I'm in the second year of a PhD, a module called Partisans and Collaborators in the Second World War. Very interesting. But we were talking about how horizontal collaborators, or women who had relations with German soldiers, would often be shamed, beaten, and their heads would be shaven by French civilians, French police. And one of my students just said, I don't understand what's in it for these men, why do they do it? And I literally just said catharsis. And the whole class went, oh, because it's this idea that you have to, the students they hadn't been taught in school to look at history from the perspective of emotions. And so as soon as they understood things like wounded masculinity and pride and these things and how they play into people's decision making, it made a lot more sense to them. And then just on the point about education, in the same module, so it's very relevant, we discussed how Sarkozy made it mandatory for a specific letter by a 17-and-a-half-year-old French communist who was given over to the Nazis and eventually executed. His letter to his parents is read out, is made mandatory reading in high schools. And the problem with this is it's not correctly contextualized. The French, Sarkozy uses it as a political way of making France a default victim rather than a potential collaborator in the Second World War, which in many senses it was. And the problem with this is, like I said, they don't give the correct context in the education. And so what we're talking about education today, it's the idea of mandatory reading to me is horrific. The idea of correctly contextualized curriculum is perfect. And then finally, on the point of Martin Luther King made down there at the front, yeah, I was in that generation. It was my A-levels, so I learned about that's what I did my A-level coursework on, and it was very, very interesting, and I'm glad I learned it. But I would have rather learned about colonial history. So.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to wrap up now. I'm going to reflect on those points. And I think that I also did the American Civil Rights Movement. And so I was doing my GCSEs, and my GCSE teacher at the time, and this is I only tell this story to counter the previous criticism I've made of teachers. He phoned me up. He said, last day, he said, you've got to hand your coursework in today or you won't get a GCSE. Well, I'm not that bothered, to be honest. It's not the be-all and end-all for me. He said, Harry, if you don't come in right now and write your coursework, I'm going to keep on phoning until I speak to your dad. I was like, that's Matthew Ferguson. It's the reason I'm here today, because that wasn't a priority for me then. I think it's about reflecting that coming at these stories happens throughout our lives. Yes, it's really important to get it more in school. I think the reason it doesn't happen more is because we all like to think of ourselves as being the good guy. But talking about this story means reflecting on the fact that not all of our story is good. A lot of it is. A lot of it's good. One of the reasons so many people were willing to come and fight for Britain and in the RAF is because we have a legacy of being engaged in humanitarian relief. You think about the Armenian massacre where Gladstone's so heavily involved. But we can also reflect on Gladstone's past. We can also say that was a big influence in Cyprus, for instance. We can also reflect that the RAF didn't want to pay people from Cyprus the same rate as RAF workers. They paid them 3/4 of the rate of RAF workers. This isn't aircrew. Now, the reason they paid them 3/4 wasn't because they thought they were worth 3/4. No, they had to pay them 3/4 because the Maltese were being paid 3/4, and the Colonial Office really thought the Cypriots would kick off if they were paid less than the Maltese. And so we've sat here and we've said, this is a great story, fantastic story, and it is, but it isn't wholly positive. The RAF did not just do positive things. There are negative parts of this story as well, and it's important to reflect on those. The reason there are so few identifiable Turkish Cypriot stories to tell, because of course they were Turkish, so less European, they were Muslim. A Turkish Cypriot sergeant in the British Army in Cyprus at the time was messing in the sergeant's mess, and another sergeant refused to eat there because he was in the mess at the same time as him. He said he would not have his meals there whilst this sergeant was there. And the solution was that the Cypriot sergeant would go and eat somewhere else. He wouldn't use the mess. Now, that's not a positive story. We talked about the colour bar. Yes, the RAF said it didn't want to back in. But it also said that what we should do is discriminate through practice, not policy. That we will cleverly manage who we approve of. They've got to be the right type of people, and we'll use that. Slessor, who goes on to be the Chief of the Air Staff, is the air member for personnel and talks explicitly about the way that they can use a practice of discrimination rather than a policy to stop people of colour joining the RAF. And the arguments are the same, whether or not they're for Indian, Cypriot, Caribbean, I imagine in some cases Irish as well, though it's different, of course, because it's a white, but I think Catholic becomes different as well, that personnel wouldn't take orders from people of non-European descent. They just couldn't stomach that, could they? And I think there is room to be critical. That doesn't mean that there aren't enormous positives to tell as well. And we should be proud enough of what we have done to reflect on both the good and the bad, and have the belief in our ideas that they're strong enough to withstand criticism where it's deserved. So I think that's what's important for me to take away, and I'm so pleased we've been able to host some really phenomenal research, both from people who've been sharing this research for a while now, and I think, have you seen, made an enormous contribution to people, to stories which we don't hear often enough, to brand new research. And I want to end on the words of Errol Barrow when he talked about you need to look in the mirror, as he said, as he was running for Prime Minister of Barbados. He gave us a fantastic speech. If you haven't read it, read it. He says you need to look in the mirror and decide who you are, what your country should be. And we should all look in the mirror and say, what is it that we want? What is it we want to do to move forward? And how can we use the past and our history to do that? So thank you very much. Nina, if you'd like to. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my role just to close things off, really, and I wanted to begin by thanking all of you for coming along today and attending. I'm sure, like me, you have enjoyed it and found it quite inspirational, and we've come at this with the idea of exploring the different diversity and the diverse angles of the RAF story. And I'm sure you agree that we've heard so much today. I'm still buzzing, and I've written lots of different notes that I'll be taking away with me. Just some of the things that we've obviously heard about today is the phenomenal courage displayed by individuals who were serving, the pioneering service that was given by those in those first years of aerial warfare, and just the dedication to their duties during their service. And also I was struck by the impact. We talk about the RAF story, and that's what we do here at the museum. We're looking at the RAF, but it's also the story of those who are serving. But it's really interesting to look at what came before, what the backgrounds of those who were serving influenced why they were serving with the RAF, but also the legacy of that service and what those people went on to achieve after they had left the service. So today really was about having that opportunity to bring people together, to find out more, to investigate and to explore the breadth and depth of the RAF story. But I think coming out of what we've learnt today is that diversity of the individual's experience as well. And I think I was really struck by, we're talking about different communities, but there's so many parallels that can be drawn, and some of the links that were being made today, and those connections, and enjoying those stories to be researched afterwards. So I think just to say that this is just one aspect of the work that we're doing at the museum, and it was great to hear from Sarah and the work that her department is doing in this area. And basically it's a constant part of our work. It's a live topic for us. Member of the curatorial team has recently found out some information about Alma Veronica Labadi, who was a Jamaican who served in the WAF and who was a Pan-Africanist activist, and feminist as well. And we're always coming across these stories which we can then share with our audiences, which is really great. So I'm sure that you would like to join with me in thanking our speakers for today, but also our organisers as well. Peter Devitt's vision for bringing this event together, but also Harry for running it and bringing it together, and Stephen at the back doing our IT as well. So if I could encourage you just to show your appreciation for that as well. So thank you for attending, and do enjoy the rest of your visit to the museum. I believe the tea and coffee might still be in the art gallery if you're quick as well. But thank you very much.